The ships appeared first as dark lines against a silver horizon, their sails swollen with wind that had carried them beyond the boundaries of certainty. The North Atlantic did not forgive hesitation. Waves struck the wooden hulls with cold authority, and the sea stretched in every direction like an unfinished sentence. It was near the year 1000 A.D. when these vessels, carved from Scandinavian timber and stitched with iron rivets, pressed toward a land few in Europe truly understood. Behind them lay Iceland, already a frontier. Before them waited Greenland, vast, severe, and unnamed in the imagination of most of Christendom. What compels families to sail toward such isolation? What confidence persuades men and women to bring cattle, sheep, timber beams, and sacred relics across waters that swallow ships without ceremony? The answer was not recklessness. It was conviction, the belief that land, once found, could be shaped into permanence. The origin of this migration began not with glory, but exile. Erik the Red, cast out from Iceland after violent disputes, sailed west in search of territory unclaimed by rival chieftains. When he returned, he spoke of fjords cut deep into the southwestern coast, of valleys where grass grew during the brief Arctic summer. He named it Greenland, a word chosen with care. It suggested fertility. It promised possibility. The name was less a description than an invitation, and the invitation was accepted. In 985 A.D., a fleet departed Iceland carrying settlers who were neither raiders nor adventurers alone, but farmers, craftsmen, women, and children. They transported livestock in cramped conditions below deck, iron tools carefully packed against corrosion, seeds preserved with hope. Not every ship survived the crossing. Storms scattered the fleet. Some vessels vanished. Yet enough arrived to establish what would become the eastern and western settlements along Greenland's sheltered fjords. The coastline they encountered was deceptive. Massive ice sheets dominated the interior, rising like frozen continents. But along narrow fjord systems, protected from the harshest winds, patches of land softened in summer light. Grass emerged. Low shrubs clung to soil. For settlers accustomed to Iceland's rugged terrain, it seemed manageable. The first structures rose cautiously. Longhouses were constructed from stone foundations packed with turf. Walls were thick, insulating against winter's advance. Roofs were layered with sod, blending dwellings into the landscape. Smoke escaped through openings that allowed light but little warmth to escape. Inside, space was communal. Families shared benches along walls. Animals were often brought indoors during the coldest months, their breath mingling with human breath in dim interiors scented with hay and wool. Survival depended on rhythm. Summer was a narrow window of urgency. Grass had to be cut, dried, and stored as hay before frost returned. Every bundle represented insurance against hunger. Cattle grazed cautiously on fragile slopes. Sheep and goats climbed higher terrain. Men and women worked side by side, aware that a miscalculation in fodder could mean death when darkness lengthened. Yet there was confidence in these early years. Archaeological layers suggest that the initial generations prospered modestly. Livestock numbers were stable. Dairy production sustained communities. Meat supplemented diets. Driftwood and imported timber supported construction. The Norse brought with them not only tools, but law and social structure. Farms were organized under chieftains. Property boundaries were marked. Disputes were mediated through assemblies modeled after Scandinavian tradition. They were building not merely shelters, but society. Christianity accompanied them. Churches were erected within decades of settlement. Some were modest wooden structures. Others, later, were built of stone with surprising architectural ambition. At Garthar, the episcopal seat emerged as a symbol of Greenland's integration into European Christendom. Bishops traveled across treacherous waters to oversee spiritual life. Tithes were collected. Latin prayers echoed against Arctic stone. Greenland was not imagined as an outpost detached from Europe. It was a distant extension of it. Trade reinforced this identity. Ships sailed between Greenland, Iceland, and Norway, though irregularly. They carried walrus ivory, hides, and ropes made from walrus skin commodities prized in European markets. In return came iron, timber, and grain. Without imported iron, tools could not be repaired. Without timber, ships could not be maintained. Greenland's isolation was mitigated by maritime lifelines. The settlers understood their vulnerability. They were dependent on forces beyond their control: weather, trade winds, distant markets. But in these early centuries, the system functioned. The fjords bustled during summer. Boats navigated sheltered waters. Livestock grazed under the low sun. Children grew up knowing no homeland but this austere landscape. Identity adapted subtly. They were Norse, but they were also Greenlanders, familiar with ice patterns, seal migrations, and the silence of winter. Winter was long and unyielding. Darkness consumed daylight hours. Storms sealed fjords with ice. Inside longhouses, families repaired tools, spun wool, and told stories of ancestral lands. Livestock fed on carefully measured hay. Every decision made months earlier during harvest revealed its wisdom or its error. And yet, through cycles of season and labor, confidence persisted. For generations, Greenland did not appear fragile. It appeared disciplined. Communities maintained social cohesion. Churches were maintained. Trade continued. Walrus hunting expeditions ventured north into icy waters, retrieving tusks that would adorn European courts and cathedrals. Greenland was distant but not forgotten. But this was only the beginning. Beneath the appearance of stability lay a delicate balance. The soil was thin. Grasslands were limited. Climate, though relatively mild in the 11th century, was never guaranteed to remain so. The settlers had committed themselves to a European agrarian model in a landscape that tolerated little excess. Their greatest strength, their cultural continuity, was also their constraint. As the 11th century gave way to the 12th and 13th, small changes accumulated. Winters grew incrementally colder. Sea ice lingered longer in spring. Growing seasons shortened by subtle margins. Each shift alone was manageable. Together, they tightened the margins of survival. Yet in these early centuries, hope remained unbroken. Greenland was no longer an experiment. It was a homeland. Stone churches stood firm against wind. Farms clustered along fjords like beads on a string. Children inherited land. Generations passed. They believed they had mastered the edge of the world. They did not yet know how narrow that edge truly was. By the 13th century, Greenland no longer felt like an experiment. It felt established. Farms had stood for generations. Families could trace their lineage back to the original settlers who had crossed the ocean with Erik the Red's promise echoing in their minds. The longhouses had been repaired and rebuilt, barns expanded, churches strengthened with stone walls that suggested permanence rather than improvisation. On the surface, the Norse presence along Greenland's fjords appeared secure. But security in Greenland was always conditional. Daily life revolved around precision. A Greenland farm was not simply a home, it was a carefully balanced system. Cattle were the core of that system. They provided milk, butter, cheese, and status. To own cattle meant stability. Yet cattle required vast amounts of winter fodder. The brief Arctic summer dictated relentless labor. Grass had to be cut at the perfect moment. Too early and yields were weak. Too late and frost threatened. Hayfields were precious. Every patch of green along the fjord was claimed and managed. Men and women worked in coordinated urgency. Hay was scythed, dried, stacked, and transported to storage sheds. Children gathered smaller bundles. Livestock were rotated carefully to avoid stripping soil bare. The fragility of the land was apparent. Greenland's topsoil was thin, easily eroded by overgrazing and wind. Unlike Norway, forests were scarce. There was no surplus of timber to replenish fences and ships. Driftwood washed ashore was collected almost reverently. Winter was the true judge. When snow sealed the fjords and sea ice locked harbors, farms turned inward. Inside the longhouses, light flickered against walls of turf and stone. The air grew heavy with the smell of animals and smoke. Food stores were counted and rationed. Cattle were fed carefully measured hay, sometimes culled if supplies proved insufficient. Sheep and goats were hardier, But even they could not survive prolonged shortages, and yet, for centuries, this rhythm endured. The sea compensated where the land faltered. Seal hunting intensified over time. Early generations had relied heavily on beef and dairy, but archaeological evidence reveals a gradual shift. Seal bones appear more frequently in later deposits. Harp seals migrating along the coast became essential protein sources. Walrus expeditions ventured farther north, sometimes hundreds of kilometers into icy waters. Walrus ivory was Greenland's economic heartbeat. Tusks harvested in Arctic hunts traveled thousands of miles to European markets. In medieval cathedrals and royal courts, ivory carvings bore no trace of their origin in Greenland's cold fjords. But those carvings represented lifelines. Through ivory, Greenland remained relevant to distant kingdoms. Ships sailed west with iron bars, timber planks, grain sacks, and clerical officials. They sailed east laden with tusks, hides, and rope. Trade, however, was irregular by nature. The North Atlantic did not guarantee safe passage. Storms wrecked vessels. Sea ice shifted unpredictably. A single failed voyage could mean years without resupply. Greenlanders learned patience, but patience did not replace iron. Meanwhile, the wider world was shifting. In Norway, political structures evolved. Greenland fell under Norwegian rule in the 13th century, formalizing its place within the medieval Scandinavian sphere. A bishopric at Garthar reinforced ecclesiastical authority. Stone churches expanded. The Norse in Greenland maintained Latin rites and European customs. They were not culturally adrift. They were tethered by faith and governance. Yet geography imposed distance that administration could not erase. While Greenland preserved European identity, another culture expanded across the Arctic. The Thule people, ancestors of the Inuit, migrated eastward into Greenland during the 13th century. They brought with them technologies finely tuned to polar environments, dog sleds, kayaks, sophisticated harpoons designed for whale hunting. They moved seasonally, adapting fluidly to ice and water. The Norse approach was different. Their identity was anchored in livestock farming. They built permanent farms, invested in fixed structures, and oriented society around European agricultural norms. Where the Inuit embraced marine mobility, the Norse maintained terrestrial permanence. Archaeological traces suggest some contact between the two groups. There may have been limited trade, perhaps iron tools exchanged for Arctic goods. There may have been tension. Norse sagas speak vaguely of Skrælings, but Greenland's archaeological record is restrained, offering fragments rather than narratives. What is evident is contrast. As climate patterns shifted subtly in the 13th century, that contrast grew more consequential. The medieval warm period, which had favored early settlement, began to cool. Summers, shortened by increments, are almost imperceptible within a single lifetime but undeniable across generations. Sea ice extended farther into shipping lanes. Pastures produced slightly less hay. The changes were gradual but cumulative. Farmers responded as they always had by working harder. Seal hunting intensified further. Cattle herds were adjusted. Some farms may have shifted toward more sheep and goats, which required less fodder. Diet became increasingly marine. The Norse were not passive. They adapted within the framework they understood. But adaptation had limits. European demand for walrus ivory declined in the 14th century as African elephant ivory entered markets through expanding trade routes. Greenland's primary export lost value. Ships from Norway became less frequent. The Black Death devastated Scandinavia beginning in 1349, reducing population and administrative capacity. Greenland, already peripheral, drifted further from the center of attention. Isolation deepened. Without regular shipments of iron, tools broke and could not be replaced. Without timber imports, ship repair became difficult. Without ships, trade halted. The network that had sustained Greenland for centuries thinned to threads. At the same time, climate cooling intensified. The early stages of what would later be called the Little Ice Age brought harsher winters and expanding sea ice. Growing seasons shortened further, fjords froze longer, storms increased in severity. For a society balanced on narrow ecological margins, these pressures compounded. The Western settlement was the first to falter. Archaeological evidence suggests abandonment in the mid-14th century. Houses were vacated. Livestock bones show signs of stress. There is no evidence of violent destruction, no charred ruins or mass graves. Instead, there is absence. The eastern settlement endured longer, farms persisted, churches remained active, but signs of strain accumulate in the archaeological record. Cattle numbers declined. Marine reliance increased. Some farms were abandoned. Inside longhouses during these later centuries, conversations must have changed, not openly despairing, but cautious. Hay yields compared year to year. Rumors of ships delayed. Reports of sea ice blocking harbors longer than expected. Questions whispered about whether the old balance still held. They were still Greenlanders, still Norse, still farmers and parishioners, but the edge of the world was sharpening, and the system that had once appeared stable was tightening under forces neither fully visible nor easily resisted. By the late 14th century, Greenland was no longer the confident frontier it had once been. The fjords remained beautiful, serene stretches of cold blue water framed by dark mountains, but beneath that stillness lay uncertainty. The system that had sustained Norse Greenland for nearly 4 centuries was fraying, not through a single catastrophic blow, but through quiet attrition. The Western settlement had already fallen silent. Its farms, once sustained by careful cycles of haymaking and seal hunting, were abandoned. Archaeologists would later find empty longhouses, livestock bones, and traces of final occupation, but no evidence of dramatic violence. It was as if the community had slowly thinned until nothing remained but structures exposed to wind and snow. Whether its inhabitants migrated south, returned to Iceland, or succumbed to famine remains uncertain. The silence itself is the most haunting evidence. In the eastern settlement, life continued, though perhaps with diminishing confidence. The bishopric at Garthar remained active. Churches still stood. Stone walls weathered storms with quiet endurance. Yet the world beyond Greenland was changing rapidly. Norway, Greenland's political and ecclesiastical overseer, was transformed by the Black Death beginning in 1349. The population collapsed across Scandinavia. Trade networks were disrupted. Administrative oversight weakened. Fewer ships sailed west. For Greenland, this mattered profoundly. Trade was not luxury, it was necessity. Iron tools could not be forged locally in sufficient quantities. Timber for shipbuilding was scarce. Grain imports supplemented diets. When ships stopped arriving regularly, isolation intensified beyond anything previous generations had experienced. Climate compounded this isolation. The cooling trend that had begun gradually in the 13th century deepened. The early phases of the Little Ice Age brought longer winters and more persistent sea ice. Shipping seasons narrowed. Harbors froze earlier and thawed later. Storms intensified across the North Atlantic. A missed trading year might once have been manageable. Consecutive missed years strained endurance. Within farms, adjustments became sharper. Archaeological analysis of animal bones reveals that cattle symbols of Norse identity declined in importance. Seal remains dominate later deposits. The diet had shifted heavily toward marine sources. This was adaptation, but also concession. Seal hunting required coordination and risk. Sea ice could be treacherous. Success depended on migratory patterns the climate itself was altering. Livestock, meanwhile, required hay that the land increasingly struggled to provide. Soil erosion had gradually reduced pasture quality. Generations of grazing had stripped fragile slopes. Combined with shorter growing seasons, this meant smaller hay yields. Smaller hay yields meant fewer animals. Fewer animals meant reduced dairy production, the core of Norse agrarian life. The system constricted like a tightening circle. And yet there is no sign of panic in the archaeological record, no hurried fortifications, no mass burials suggesting sudden plague. Instead, farms appear gradually vacated. One by one, longhouses ceased to be maintained. The walls collapsed. Roofs caved in. The final written record from Norse Greenland dates to 1408, a marriage ceremony at Hvalsey Church. It is an ordinary document, no hint of impending disappearance. A wedding suggests continuity, hope, and community life. After this record, there is silence. What followed remains debated. One possibility is gradual emigration. Some Greenlanders may have sailed back to Iceland or Norway when ships occasionally arrived. As population dwindled, sustaining community structures would have grown difficult. Priests, farmers, craftsmen, each role depended on others. Once numbers fell below a certain threshold, departure may have seemed rational. Another theory suggests starvation exacerbated by climate cooling and trade collapse. Skeletal evidence shows some nutritional stress. If sea ice blocked seal migrations or made hunting more dangerous, marine reliance could falter. Combined with poor harvests, famine becomes plausible. There is also speculation about assimilation. The Tula Inuit, highly adapted to Arctic conditions, occupied much of Greenland by the 15th century. Though direct evidence of integration is sparse, cultural exchange is possible. Yet, if assimilation occurred, it left little trace in material culture. What is striking is not how they disappeared, but how long they endured before doing so. For nearly 5 centuries, Norse Greenland persisted in one of the harshest inhabited landscapes in the medieval world. That longevity challenges simplistic narratives of collapse. They did not fail quickly. They did not vanish at the first sign of hardship. They adapted repeatedly, shifting diet, intensifying hunting, adjusting herds. But adaptation operates within limits. The Norse approach to Greenland was grounded in permanence. They built fixed farms. They invested in stone churches. They preserved European dress and agricultural identity. This continuity gave structure and meaning to life at the edge of the world. Yet when environmental and economic conditions shifted beyond manageable thresholds, that same permanence limited flexibility. In contrast, Inuit culture was built around mobility and marine specialization. Dog sleds allowed seasonal movement. Kayaks enabled efficient hunting across shifting ice. Food storage techniques supported resilience. These differences were not moral judgments, they were strategic divergences shaped by the environment. Greenland revealed which strategy aligned more closely with Arctic reality. Modern climate science has deepened understanding of this transformation. Ice cores extracted from Greenland's interior preserve atmospheric records stretching back thousands of years. They confirm cooling trends during the 14th and 15th centuries. Sediment studies reveal erosion patterns linked to overgrazing. Marine data reconstruct expanding sea ice coverage in critical shipping lanes. The Norse were not ignorant of climate, they experienced it intimately. But without meteorological forecasting or global trade redundancy, they were exposed to its full force. Standing today among the ruins of Hayvalsi Church, one confronts endurance rather than failure. The stone walls remain, weathered yet intact. Grass grows where congregations once gathered. The fjord reflects the sky in silence. There is no dramatic monument to collapse, only absence. And that absence carries a lesson. Civilizations rarely collapse in a single moment. More often, they narrow. Margins shrink. Trade declines incrementally. Climate shifts subtly. Institutions persist, even as their foundations weaken. Eventually, a threshold is crossed, not always visible at the time, and departure becomes quieter than disaster. Viking Greenland is not merely a medieval curiosity, it is a mirror across centuries. It asks whether societies can adapt deeply enough when environmental and economic systems shift. It challenges assumptions about resilience. It reminds us that endurance, while powerful, is not infinite. The Norse settlers who crossed the Atlantic around 1000 AD did so with extraordinary courage. They built farms in Arctic fjords. They raised children who knew no other homeland. They carved walrus ivory that adorned European courts. They prayed in stone churches under northern skies. They did not conquer Greenland. They negotiated with it. For centuries, that negotiation held. Then, quietly, it ended. Ships stopped arriving. Farms emptied. Livestock vanished from valleys. Wind moved through abandoned doorways. Snow covered collapsed roofs. The edge of the world reclaimed its silence. Yet their story persists, not as tragedy alone, but as testament. Testament to ambition, to endurance, to the fragile balance between identity and adaptation. At the very edge of the known world, they lived. For nearly 500 years they endured. And in their endurance, before order returned to ice and wind, we find both warning and awe.